I stood in the doorway of the grand ballroom, watching my sister spin in front of the floor-length mirrors, her newly dyed platinum blonde hair catching the light like spun silver. My old hair color. The one I'd spent 3 years perfecting in my first life. The one that had made me famous. It's perfect, she breathed, running her fingers through the silky strands. Everyone's going to think I'm the original, that you copied me. My mother stood beside her, nodding approvingly. Much better than that mousy brown you had, Melissa. You look like you could actually be part of this family now. I touched my own hair, the rich chestnut brown that had once been Melissa's signature color. The color she'd spent years cultivating before abandoning it 6 months after my rebirth. In my previous life, I'd had the same brown hair until I was 22, when I'd finally saved enough to transform it into that stunning platinum that had launched my modeling career. Melissa had watched, seething with jealousy, as photographers fell over themselves to book me, as brands wanted my face, as I became everything she'd failed to be, and then she'd stolen it, stolen my color, my style, my contracts, and eventually, my life. But this time, I'd seen it coming. I like brown, I said quietly, meeting my sister's eyes in the mirror. It suits me. She smirked, that familiar, cruel twist of her lips I remembered so well from before. Brown suits the help, Amber, but I suppose you'll figure that out eventually. My mother laughed, sharp and cutting. That laugh had been the soundtrack to my childhood. To both my childhoods, technically. Don't be mean, Melissa, she chided, without any real conviction. Your sister simply doesn't have your natural sense of style. Not everyone can be blessed with your talents. I said nothing. In my previous life, I would have argued, would have pointed out that Melissa had no talents beyond manipulation and spending our father's money. Would have defended myself until my voice went hoarse and my mother's disappointment crystallized into active cruelty. This time, I just smiled, because this time I knew exactly what was coming. I knew that in 3 weeks, Melissa's attempt to crash my photo shoot would backfire spectacularly when the photographer, the one she'd been sleeping with to sabotage my career, would see her platinum hair and realize she was the copy, not the original. I knew that her desperate grab for my identity would become her prison. And I knew that my brown hair, rich, glossy, and utterly unassuming, would become my armor. You're right, Mother, I said, turning away from the mirror. I could never compete with Melissa. My sister's expression flickered with surprise, then settled into smug satisfaction. She had no idea that she'd already lost, that she'd been losing from the moment I opened my eyes in this second life, 3 days after my 18th birthday, with memories of the next 7 years burning in my mind. The memories of how she'd stolen everything from me, how she'd poisoned me, slowly and methodically, until my kidneys failed and I died alone in a hospital bed at 29, with no one believing that my own sister had murdered me. This time would be different. This time, I was the one with all the advantages. The memories hit me like a tidal wave on the morning of my 18th birthday, in this life and the last. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs as 7 years of future memories slammed into my consciousness. I remembered dying. I remembered the slow deterioration of my body, the mysterious illness that doctors couldn't quite diagnose, the way my skin had turned sallow, my hair had fallen out in clumps, my organs had systematically shut down. I remembered Melissa visiting me in the hospital, her face arranged in perfect concern while she handed me smoothies she'd made specially for me. The smoothies that were killing me. I remembered figuring it out too late in the last weeks of my life, when I'd accidentally seen her researching slow-acting poisons on her laptop. When I'd put together the timeline and realized that my illness had started shortly after my modeling career had taken off, after I'd finally achieved something she couldn't steal or buy. I remembered confronting her, my voice weak and raspy, and the way she'd laughed. Actually laughed. "You're dying, Amber," she'd said, perched on the edge of my hospital bed like a beautiful vulture. "No one's going to believe you. And even if they did, you'll be dead before any investigation goes anywhere. Mother and father already think you're delusional from the medications. This is just sad." She'd been right. I'd died 3 weeks later, alone, unmourned except for performative grief from my family. But somehow, impossibly, I'd woken up here. 7 years in the past. In my childhood bedroom with its faded wallpaper and secondhand furniture. Such a stark contrast to Melissa's suite down the hall with its designer everything. I'd sat up slowly, checking my arms for the IV marks that had been there when I died. Smooth, unblemished skin. I'd run to the mirror, expecting to see the skeletal wraith I'd become, but instead found my 18-year-old face staring back. Round cheeks, bright eyes, my natural brown hair falling in healthy waves around my shoulders. I'd wept. Not from joy, not yet, but from the sheer, overwhelming reality of it. I had another chance. The question was, what would I do with it? Those first few days, I'd moved through the house like a ghost haunting my own life. Everything was exactly as I remembered it, but now I saw it all through different eyes. I saw the casual cruelty in how my mother assigned me the smallest bedroom, the one with the broken radiator that left me shivering through winter nights. I saw the calculated way Melissa borrowed my things and returned them broken, her apologies as hollow as her eyes. I saw my father's disinterest, the way he looked through me as if I were a stranger rather than his daughter. It had always been this way. I just hadn't let myself see it so clearly before. In my first life, I'd been born Amber Matthews, second daughter to Richard and Catherine Matthews. But I'd never really been their daughter. I'd been an accident, an inconvenience, a girl who'd had the misfortune of being born 2 years after their perfect Melissa. Melissa, who'd had my mother's green eyes and my father's sharp cheekbones. Melissa, who'd been doted on and praised and given every opportunity. Melissa, who'd grown up believing the world owed her everything. And me? I'd been the plain one, the forgettable one, the one they kept around out of obligation and occasional guilt. I remembered family dinners where they'd discussed Melissa's future while I sat silently at the end of the table. I remembered birthdays where my gifts were practical, socks, school supplies, while Melissa received designer handbags and jewelry. I remembered my mother casually mentioning to friends that she really only had one daughter while I stood right there. It had hurt in my first life. I'd spent years trying to win their love, trying to be good enough, trying to matter. But I'd learned eventually that I couldn't earn something they'd never intended to give, and so I'd left. I'd moved out the day after my high school graduation, working 3 jobs to pay for a tiny studio apartment and putting myself through community college. I'd been so tired all the time, surviving on coffee and determination. But I'd been free. And then I'd discovered modeling. It had been an accident, really. I'd been working a catering gig at a photography studio when the model for their shoot hadn't shown up. The photographer had been desperate, and I'd been there. And something about the way the light hit my face had made him ask if I'd fill in. I'd said yes because I needed the money. But standing in front of that camera, I'd felt something shift inside me. For the first time in my life, someone was looking at me. Really looking at me. Seeing me. The photos had been beautiful, raw, and haunting in a way the photographer said he hadn't captured in years. He'd asked me to come back. Other photographers had called. Slowly, incrementally, I'd built something that was entirely mine. That's when I dyed my hair platinum. It had been a statement, a transformation, a way of saying I was no longer that invisible girl from my parents' house. The color had been striking against my pale skin and dark eyes. Editorial, they'd called it. Memorable. It had worked. My career had exploded. By 22, I was booking major campaigns. By 24, I was on magazine covers. By 25, I had enough money saved to never worry about rent again. And that's when Melissa had noticed me. I'd been doing a shoot for a luxury watch brand when she'd shown up at the studio. Uninvited, unexpected, perfect as always in her designer outfit and her own brown hair styled in effortless waves. "Amber!" she'd called out as if we were close, as if she hadn't ignored my existence for the 7 years since I'd left home. "Mother told me you were doing some modeling. I had to come see." She'd watched me work with an expression I couldn't quite read. At the time, I'd thought maybe she was proud of me. Maybe she was finally seeing me as something other than the disappointing sister. I'd been so stupid. Within 2 months, she'd dyed her hair platinum. I was inspired by Amber, she'd told our mother, who'd immediately proclaimed it gorgeous and sophisticated and so much better than my attempt at glamour. Within 4 months, she'd started booking modeling jobs. Not through talent or hard work, she'd been sleeping with Marcus Chen, one of the biggest photographers in the industry. A married man, 20 years her senior, who'd been willing to sabotage my career to keep her happy. Within 6 months, she'd been getting the jobs that should have been mine. Photographers I'd worked with for years suddenly had scheduling conflicts when my agent called. Brands I'd built relationships with went silent. I'd confronted Marcus once. He'd looked at me with something like pity. "You're good, Amber," he'd said. "But Melissa's magnetic. She's got something you don't. Star quality." What she had was no conscience, and our parents' money backing her. What she had was a willingness to destroy me to get what she wanted. The poisoning had started around then. Just little things at first. Feeling tired, vaguely nauseous. I'd thought it was stress. When it got worse, I'd thought it was the flu. By the time I realized something was seriously wrong, the damage was irreversible. Melissa had visited me often in the hospital that first year when I could still have visitors. She'd bring me food. "Mother made your favorite soup," and gossip about the modeling world I was losing. She'd hold my hand and tell me how much everyone missed me, and all the while, she'd been killing me. Now, standing in my 18-year-old body, I felt the rage of those memories like hot coals in my chest. But underneath the rage was something colder, something calculating. I had 7 years of knowledge. I knew every mistake I'd made, every opportunity I'd missed, every person who'd betrayed me. I knew what was coming, and this time I would be ready. The first thing I did was apply to different colleges. In my previous life, I'd gone to community college because it was all I could afford. This time, I applied for every scholarship I could find, and I applied to state universities with good business programs. I needed education. I needed credentials. I needed to build something Melissa couldn't steal because she was too lazy to do the actual work. The second thing I did was skip the modeling entirely, at first. I knew that if I followed the same path, Melissa would follow me again. She was predictable that way. Whatever I had, she wanted. Whatever made me special, she needed to consume. So I let her think I was nothing. I kept my head down, got a job at a bookstore, and started saving money. I enrolled in summer classes and winter courses, graduating a year early with a degree in business administration and a minor in marketing. I was careful, methodical, boring. Melissa ignored me completely, which was exactly what I wanted. She spent those years partying, dating, and burning through our parents' money. She tried her hand at fashion blogging, which failed. She tried to become an influencer, which went nowhere. She was beautiful and charming and utterly without substance, and the world was starting to notice. I watched her flail with cold satisfaction, and then, when I was 21 in this timeline, 3 years after my rebirth, I made my move. I'd been working with a startup marketing company, proving myself valuable and learning everything I could about brand building and social media strategy. I'd been preparing. And when one of our clients, a small sustainable fashion brand, needed a face for their campaign, I suggested myself. Not as a model, as their brand director and face of their marketing campaign. A working woman who believed in their mission. Authentic, they called it. Relatable. And I dyed my hair brown, rich, glossy chocolate brown with caramel highlights. Professional, elegant. Nothing like the platinum I'd had before. The campaign was a massive success. The brand's sales tripled. Other companies started calling. Within 6 months, I'd left the startup to launch my own marketing consultancy, specializing in authentic brand partnerships. Within a year, I was more successful than I'd ever been in my first life. And I'd done it all without Melissa even noticing. She'd been too busy trying to salvage her social media presence, churning out sponsored posts for companies that paid her in free products rather than cash. She was still beautiful, still charming, but she was 23 and hadn't accomplished anything real. Our parents were starting to make pointed comments about her finding direction. That's when she noticed my brown hair. I'd been at a family dinner, a rare occasion since I avoided them when I could, when Melissa had really looked at me for the first time in years. "Your hair," she'd said, tilting her head. "When did you dye it brown?" "It's my natural color," I'd replied, which was technically true. I'd just enhanced it. "It's gorgeous," she'd said, and I'd heard the wheels turning in her mind. So rich and dimensional, very editorial. I'd smiled and said nothing. 2 weeks later, she'd dyed her platinum hair brown. The day Melissa walked into the family dining room with brown hair, I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. It was almost exactly like my brown, rich chestnut with caramel highlights. She'd probably shown the stylist pictures of me, though she'd die before admitting it. "What do you think?" she'd asked, spinning to show off the color. She'd been looking at our parents, not me. My mother had gasped, "Melissa, darling, it's stunning. So sophisticated. You look like a young Cindy Crawford." My father had nodded approvingly. "Much better than that platinum. This is more mature." Melissa had preened under their praise, finally glancing at me. "I was inspired by Amber's color," she'd said, as if granting me a tremendous favor. "Though mine turned out much richer, I think. The stylist said I have the perfect base for it." "It's lovely," I'd said truthfully. Because it was. And because it was also exactly what I'd wanted her to do. Phase 1 complete. Over the next few months, I watched Melissa's transformation with clinical interest. She didn't just copy my hair color, she started copying my entire aesthetic. The professional headshots I'd posted on LinkedIn, she recreated with her own photographer. The capsule wardrobe I'd been wearing for efficiency, she suddenly adopted. Even my makeup style, minimal, polished, became hers. At first, our parents praised her for finally growing up and taking inspiration from her sister's work ethic. But as the mimicry became more obvious, even they started to notice. "Melissa, sweetheart," my mother had said at another family dinner, "perhaps you should develop your own style. Amber's look is very... her..." Melissa had bristled. "This is my style. Amber copied me, if anything. I've always been the fashionable one in this family." I'd said nothing. Just ate my dinner and let her dig her own grave. Because here's what Melissa didn't understand. In my previous life, when she'd copied my platinum hair, she'd been copying something that was already associated with me. I'd built my modeling career on that look. When she stole it, she was stealing something that had value, recognition, currency. But this brown hair, this wasn't famous, this wasn't editorial, this was just hair. And the more she insisted it was her original look, the more people started to notice that it actually wasn't. I'd spent 3 years building a professional presence in the marketing world. I had a portfolio, a client list, a reputation. Melissa had social media posts and party photos. When she started trying to pivot into professional influencer content, copying my business casual aesthetic, people noticed. Comments started appearing on her posts, giving major at Amber Matthews vibes. "Wait, is this Amber's sister? The resemblance is uncanny now. Are you copying your sister's whole brand? Kind of weird." Melissa deleted the comments. Then she started blocking people. Then she went private for a week. When she came back, she'd dyed her hair platinum. I'd been having coffee with a client when I saw the Instagram post. "Melissa, blonde again," with a caption about returning to her roots and never compromising her authentic self. I'd smiled into my latte. Phase 2 complete, because now everyone who followed both of us, and there was considerable overlap, could see the timeline. Could see that she'd been brown, then platinum, while I'd been platinum, then brown. The narrative was inescapable. She'd tried to copy me, it hadn't worked, and now she was scrambling to reclaim her own identity. The comments on that post were brutal. "So you're going back to copying your sister's old look? Make it make sense. This is giving identity crisis. Your sister's brown hair was way better, TBH." Melissa had turned off comments after that, and at our next family dinner, she'd looked at me with undisguised hatred. "Happy now?" she'd hissed when we were alone in the kitchen. "You've made me look like a fool." "I haven't done anything," I'd replied truthfully. "I just lived my life. You knew I'd dye my hair brown, you planned this." I'd met her eyes then, let her see something cold and knowing in my expression. "Did I?" She'd faltered, uncertainty flickering across her face. Because how could I have known? How could I have planned it? But somewhere deep down, in that place where instinct lives, she'd sensed something was different about me. That I wasn't the same pushover sister she'd tormented our whole lives. "Stay away from me," she'd said finally, "and stay away from mother and father. They're my family, not yours." "Of course," I'd said. "They've made that very clear for 21 years. That had been 6 months ago in this timeline. 6 months of watching Melissa spiral while I continued to build my empire. But I wasn't satisfied yet, because in my previous life, she'd done more than steal my hair and my career. She'd stolen my life, and I wanted her to pay for that. The opportunity came in the form of Marcus Chen. In my previous timeline, I'd met Marcus when I was 22, freshly platinum and booking major campaigns. He'd been charming, influential, and married, though he'd conveniently forgotten to mention that last part until after we'd slept together. I'd ended things immediately when I found out. But Melissa, who'd met him through me, hadn't cared about his marital status. She'd seen a man who could give her access to the modeling world, and she'd taken him. This time, I'd never met Marcus. I'd deliberately avoided the modeling world, taking a completely different path. But I knew he was still out there, still married, still influential in fashion photography. And I knew Melissa was desperate enough to do anything to salvage her public image. So I planted a seed. I'd become friendly with a photographer named Sarah Chen, yes, Marcus's wife, through my marketing work. She hired me occasionally to consult on her studio's brand strategy. We'd developed a genuine friendship built on mutual respect and similar work ethics. Over coffee one afternoon, I'd mentioned casually that my sister was trying to break into modeling. "She's been struggling," I'd said, which was true. "I think she's looking for a photographer who could help her build a portfolio." Sarah had wrinkled her nose. "The modeling industry is brutal. Does she have experience?" "Not professional, but she's beautiful and persistent." Also true. "Marcus might know some people," Sarah had said absently. "He's always scouting for new faces." "That's kind of you," I'd said, though I'd hate for her to become another notch on some photographer's bedpost. "You hear such horror stories about the industry." Sarah had laughed, not catching my implication. "Marcus is harmless, too obsessed with his work to bother with models that way." I'd smiled and let it drop, but I'd planted the idea, and I knew Melissa well enough to know what she'd do with it. 2 weeks later, I'd accidentally left my laptop open at my parents' house, with Sarah's email about Marcus's studio visible on the screen. The email included his contact information and a note about him looking for fresh faces for an upcoming campaign. Melissa had found it, of course. She'd probably been snooping through my things deliberately, looking for something she could use. Within a week, she'd contacted Marcus. Within 2 weeks, she'd booked a test shoot with him. Within a month, she was sleeping with him. I knew because Sarah called me, devastated, asking if I'd known, if I'd suspected. "I saw the photos," she'd sobbed, "on his phone. I knew something was off, so I looked, and there they were, him and some blonde girl in our bed, Amber, our bed." I'd comforted her, genuinely upset on her behalf, because Sarah was kind and talented and didn't deserve this. The fact that I'd set it in motion made my stomach churn, but I reminded myself why I was doing this. Melissa had poisoned me. Melissa had murdered me. Melissa deserved everything coming to her. "Do you know who she is?" Sarah had asked. I'd hesitated, then said quietly, I think it might be my sister." The silence on the other end had been deafening. "Your sister, Melissa?" "I saw her post photos from a studio shoot recently," I'd said. The background looked like Marcus's studio, and she mentioned working with an amazing photographer but wouldn't say who. I didn't think, "God, Sarah, I'm so sorry. If I'd known—" "It's not your fault," Sarah had cut me off. "It's theirs." She'd hung up shortly after, and I'd sat in my apartment feeling sick and triumphant in equal measure, because now the dominoes were falling. Sarah filed for divorce. As the wife of a prominent photographer with her own successful studio, she had connections throughout the industry. Word spread quickly. Marcus Chen was a cheating scumbag who preyed on aspiring models. His business collapsed within months. Studios canceled contracts. Brands pulled campaigns. His reputation was destroyed. And Melissa, as the other woman, she became infamous. The modeling world is smaller than people think. Everyone knows everyone. And everyone knew that Melissa Matthews had slept with a married photographer to try to launch a career she had no business having. Brands wouldn't touch her. Photographers wouldn't work with her. She'd become toxic. My parents, for the first time in their lives, were ashamed of their golden child. "How could you do this to us?" my mother had shrieked at a family dinner I'd attended specifically to watch the fallout. Do you have any idea what people are saying about our family? You're saying I ruined our reputation? Melissa had shot back. What about Amber? She's the one who introduced me to him. She's the one who. I introduced you to his wife, I'd corrected calmly. As a friend. I had no idea you'd contact her husband, much less sleep with him. You left that email open on purpose. I left my laptop open while I went to the bathroom. I didn't realize you were reading my private correspondence. My father had looked between us, his face red with anger. For once, it wasn't directed at me. Melissa, he'd said, you need to take responsibility for your own choices. I'd watched my sister's face crumble and felt nothing. No sympathy, no guilt. Just cold, clean satisfaction. But I still wasn't done. Because destroying Melissa's reputation and her affair with Marcus was just the beginning. In my previous life, she'd done more than ruin my career. She'd taken my money, my health, my life. This time, I was going to take everything from her. The next phase of my plan required patience and precision. I spent months carefully documenting everything. Melissa's spending habits, her credit card debt, her complete financial dependence on our parents. I created a portfolio of her behavior, screenshots of her social media posts, records of her failed business ventures, proof of her pattern of lying and manipulation. And then I went to talk to my father. Richard Matthews was not a warm man. He'd never been affectionate with me, had barely acknowledged my existence most of my childhood. But he was a businessman, and he respected results. I'd scheduled a meeting at his office, dressed in my most professional outfit, carrying a leather portfolio that contained 3 years of my business accomplishments. Amber, he'd said when I entered, surprise evident in his voice. This is unexpected. I know we're not close, I'd said, taking the seat across from his desk. But I wanted to show you something. I'd laid out my portfolio, client testimonials, revenue reports, growth projections. My consultancy was thriving. I'd built something real, something sustainable, something that would last. My father had examined the documents silently, his expression unreadable. This is impressive, he'd said finally. I had no idea you were doing so well. You never asked. He'd winced slightly at that. No, I suppose I didn't. I'm not here for an apology, I'd continued. I'm here to make you a business proposition. I'd laid out my plan then. I wanted to expand my consultancy into a full-service agency. I had the clients, the reputation, the expertise. What I needed was capital for office space, employee salaries, and infrastructure. I'm asking for a business loan, I'd said. Market rate interest, standard terms, complete transparency. I'll pay back every penny. I'm not asking for a handout. I'm asking for an investment in a proven business model. My father had studied me for a long moment. Why come to me? You could go to a bank. Because you're my father, I'd said simply, and because I wanted to give you the chance to invest in something that will actually succeed. The implication was clear. Unlike Melissa's endless failures, he'd agreed to review my proposal. 2 weeks later, he'd transferred the money to my business account with a formal contract and repayment schedule. I'd paid him back in 18 months, ahead of schedule with interest. And in those 18 months, something had shifted. My father started inviting me to business functions. He introduced me to his colleagues. He asked my opinion on marketing strategies for his own company. For the first time in my life, Richard Matthews saw me as a person, as someone valuable. My mother was harder. Catherine Matthews had built her identity around Melissa, her beautiful, perfect daughter who reflected well on her. Having that daughter exposed as a homewrecker and social pariah had shaken her to her core. But I didn't need my mother's approval. I'd stopped needing it in my first life, around the time I realized it would never come. What I needed was to make sure Melissa could never hurt anyone again. That's when I discovered the trust fund. I'd been going through old family documents for my business, legitimate research into tax structures, when I'd found it. A trust fund set up by my paternal grandmother, who'd died when I was 5. She'd left money for both her granddaughters to be accessed when we turned 25. In my previous life, I'd never known about this trust fund. I'd died at 29, and if anyone had mentioned it, I'd been too sick to remember. But now, at 24 in this timeline, I had access to the documents, and I could see that the trust was substantial, more than enough to be life-changing. I could also see that Melissa would get access to hers in 6 months when she turned 25. And I could see a loophole in the trust's structure. The funds could be released early in cases of proven financial hardship and demonstrated responsibility. It required approval from the trustee, my father, and documentation of need. I applied for early release immediately, submitting my business records and financial statements. I made a case that the capital would allow me to expand internationally, creating jobs and generating significant returns. My father approved it within a week. I received my trust fund at 24. It was more money than I'd ever imagined having, enough to turn my consultancy into a major agency, enough to never worry about security again. And then I made sure Melissa would never see hers. It wasn't difficult. Melissa's financial records were a disaster. Maxed out credit cards, defaulted loans, a history of bounced checks. Her credit score was in the basement. She had no income, no assets, no proof of responsibility. When she applied for early release 6 months later, citing urgent need, my father denied her. "You haven't demonstrated financial responsibility," he'd told her at a family dinner I'd orchestrated specifically to witness this moment. "The trust will release when you turn 25, as originally planned. But maybe having to wait will teach you some discipline." "But I need it now," Melissa had argued. "I have debts." "Debts you created through poor decisions," our father had cut her off. "Amber demonstrated years of fiscal responsibility before accessing her trust. You've demonstrated nothing but poor judgment. Amber got hers early. Amber earned it, you haven't—" I'd watched my sister's face contort with rage and humiliation. This was the girl who'd poisoned me slowly over months, who'd watched me die without remorse. This was the woman who'd stolen my career, my identity, my life, and now she was learning what it felt like to have nothing. But I still wasn't done. The final phase of my revenge required the most careful planning. Because I didn't just want to ruin Melissa's reputation and finances. I wanted her to face legal consequences for what she'd done to me in my previous life. The problem was, in this timeline, she hadn't done it yet. She hadn't poisoned me because I'd never given her the opportunity. But I knew she would try, so I set a trap. It started with a rumor, carefully planted through mutual acquaintances, that I was sick. Nothing serious, just stress, maybe a vitamin deficiency. I'd been working so hard, pushing myself so much. I made sure Melissa heard it. Then I made sure she saw an opportunity. I'd started attending family dinners more regularly, knowing she'd be there. I'd mention, casually, how tired I'd been feeling. How I couldn't seem to shake this exhaustion. "You should see a doctor," my mother would say with the bare minimum of concern. "I have," I'd reply. "They can't find anything wrong, they think it's stress." I'd watch Melissa's face during these conversations. Watch the wheels turning. Watch her remember how, in our past life, she'd gotten away with poisoning me by making everyone think I was just stressed and overworked. I knew she'd try it again. She was predictable that way. The difference was, this time, I was ready. I installed cameras in my apartment, discreet, high quality, backed up to cloud storage. I documented everything I ate and drank, keeping meticulous records. I even started wearing a smartwatch that tracked my vital signs constantly, and I waited, and it took 3 months. Melissa showed up at my apartment unannounced, carrying a container of soup. "Mother made it," she'd said, smiling that fake smile I knew so well. "She's worried about you. We all are." "That's kind," I'd said, taking the container. "Thank you." I'd put it in the refrigerator, waited for her to leave, then immediately transferred it to a sealed evidence bag. I'd taken it to a private lab the next day. The results came back 2 days later. Traces of antifreeze in the soup. Not enough to kill me immediately, but more than enough to cause the kind of cumulative organ damage that would look like natural illness over time. I'd sat in my apartment, staring at the lab report, and felt that cold rage crystallize into diamond-hard purpose. She'd done it again, or tried to. Even after everything I'd taken from her, even after all her failures, she still wanted me dead. I went to the police. I brought the lab results, the video footage of Melissa delivering the soup, documentation of her history of lying and manipulation. I even brought a therapist, someone I'd been seeing regularly to process my complicated feelings about being reborn. Who could testify to my mental state and confirm I wasn't delusional or making this up? The detective I spoke with was skeptical at first. Attempted poisoning is hard to prove, especially when it's family. but then I played him a card I'd been holding close. This isn't the first time, I'd said. In another situation, one I can't fully explain, my sister poisoned me before. I died from it. And I think if you look at her browser history, her purchase records, you'll find evidence that she's been researching this for a while. The detective had looked at me strangely. Another situation? I can't explain it in a way that would sound sane, I'd admitted. But I know my sister, I know what she's capable of, and I know she's done this before. I'd given him the dates from my previous life, the timeline of when I'd started getting sick, when I'd died. If you can find similar research or purchases from those dates in any old records, it would support my case. It was a long shot. I didn't actually expect there to be evidence from my previous timeline, that life had been erased when I was reborn. But the detective had promised to investigate, and then something extraordinary happened. He called me 2 weeks later. "Miss Matthews," he'd said, "I don't know how you knew this, but we found something. Old police reports from 7 years ago. A woman named Amber Matthews died of organ failure under suspicious circumstances. The case was closed as natural causes, but there were notes from the investigating officer that suggested possible foul play. Your sister's name was mentioned." I'd felt the ground shift beneath me. What? The timeline matches what you told me exactly. The victim had the same name as you, same age, same family members. It's like you knew about this case somehow. I'd gripped the phone tighter. Did they investigate my sister? Not thoroughly. The victim was so sick by the end that no one believed the poisoning claims. It seemed like paranoid delusions from the medication. But if your sister is trying the same thing again, it's a pattern, I'd finished. It's premeditated. The detective had agreed to move forward with the case. They'd obtained a warrant for Melissa's apartment and found exactly what I'd known they would, a bottle of antifreeze hidden in the back of her closet, the same brand that had been in the soup. They'd found her computer history showing searches for undetectable poisons and how to cause kidney failure and symptoms of antifreeze poisoning. They'd found notebooks, actual physical notebooks, where she documented her plans. Apparently, my sister was old school when it came to murder. When they arrested her, she'd screamed that I'd set her up, that I'd planted evidence, that I was framing her. But the evidence was overwhelming. The soup, the lab results, the browser history, the notebooks in her own handwriting, the previous case that suggested a pattern. The trial lasted 3 months. My parents sat in the front row every day looking smaller and older than I'd ever seen them. They'd lost their golden child to her own cruelty. I testified about the soup, about my sister's history of taking what was mine, about my suspicions. I didn't mention being reborn. I wasn't that stupid. But I testified about the feeling I'd had that she wanted me gone, that she'd always wanted me gone. The prosecutor was brilliant. She laid out a case of long-term psychological abuse, jealousy, and attempted murder. She brought in experts who testified about sibling rivalry taken to pathological extremes. She made the jury see Melissa for what she really was, a narcissist who would rather kill than let someone else succeed. The jury deliberated for 2 days. They found her guilty on all counts: attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, conspiracy to commit murder. The judge, when sentencing her, cited the previous case, my death in the other timeline, as evidence of premeditation and pattern. Melissa was sentenced to 20 years in prison. I watched her being led away in handcuffs, and I felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction. Just a deep, quiet sense of justice. She'd killed me once. She'd tried to kill me again, and now she'd pay for both. The epilogue to my revenge came slowly, unfolding over the following years with a grace I'd never experienced in my first life. My agency flourished. Within 2 years of Melissa's conviction, I'd expanded internationally with offices in New York, London, and Tokyo. We specialized in authentic brand storytelling, and our client list read like a who's who of ethical, innovative companies. I'd built something real, something that helped people, something that couldn't be taken or copied or destroyed. My relationship with my parents transformed, though not in the way childhood me might have hoped. They never apologized for the years of neglect, never acknowledged the casual cruelty they'd shown me. But they changed how they treated me. My father started calling me for business advice. My mother invited me to charity events and introduced me to her friends as my daughter, the entrepreneur. It wasn't love, it would never be love, but it was recognition, and that was something. I also learned what had happened in my previous timeline, why there were police reports about my death, why that detective had found evidence of Melissa's crime. Apparently, I had tried to report her before I died. In those final weeks, delirious and desperate, I'd gone to the police with my suspicions. They'd taken a report, but I'd been so sick and incoherent that they'd assumed I was paranoid from medication. The case had been filed away as the ramblings of a dying woman. But the report had existed. The investigation had been logged. And when that detective went looking, 7 years later, he'd found it. My previous self had tried to get justice and failed. But somehow, impossibly, she'd left me the tools to succeed this time. I like to think of it as my past self, helping my present self. The woman I'd been, helping the woman I'd become. I never married, never had children. I'd seen too much of family dysfunction to want to create my own. Instead, I poured my energy into my business and into mentoring young women who reminded me of myself. Smart, capable, overlooked. I created a scholarship fund in my grandmother's name, the one who'd left me the trust fund. It paid for college educations for girls from difficult family situations, girls who needed a chance to escape and build something better. I funded it generously. Hundreds of young women received opportunities they'd never have had otherwise. It felt like the best use of my second chance. Sarah Chen and I remained friends. She'd rebuilt her life after divorcing Marcus, and her photography studio became one of the most successful in the industry. We'd have lunch sometimes, and she'd thank me for being there during that difficult time. I never told her I'd orchestrated it. Some secrets were better kept. Marcus himself had disappeared from the industry entirely. Last I heard, he was teaching photography at a community college in the Midwest, divorced and obscure. His legacy was ruined, his name a cautionary tale. Good. As for Melissa, I never visited her in prison, never wrote to her, never acknowledged her existence except when legally required to do so. My mother visited her once a month, coming back each time more defeated and confused. She keeps saying you did this to her, she'd tell me, that you orchestrated everything. It doesn't make any sense. She's had 7 years to craft a narrative where she's the victim. I'd reply calmly, don't let her manipulate you. She tried to kill me. The evidence was overwhelming. It was true, all of it. I'd simply given Melissa enough rope to hang herself with, then documented every moment as she did it. 10 years after my rebirth, I was 35 years old, 6 years older than I'd been when I died in my first life. I'd surpassed my previous lifespan and built a life beyond anything I could have imagined. My hair was still brown, rich, glossy, expertly maintained. My natural color, enhanced and perfected. It had become my signature, more recognizable than platinum ever was. Sometimes, late at night, I'd think about that first life. About the girl I'd been, desperate for her family's love, willing to work herself to death for scraps of recognition. About the woman I'd become, slowly poisoned by the sister she'd tried so hard to surpass. I'd think about dying alone in that hospital bed, knowing the truth, but unable to make anyone believe me. And then I'd think about this life, about outsmarting Melissa at every turn, about watching her destroy herself while I built myself up, about the justice I'd achieved, not just through the legal system, but through every success that proved I was more than she'd ever be. My rebirth hadn't been a gift. It had been an opportunity, and I'd seized it with both hands. I'd turned my suffering into strength, my death into wisdom, my victimhood into victory, and I'd done it all while she was busy dyeing her hair. On the morning of my 35th birthday, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, applying my makeup with practiced precision. My brown hair fell in soft waves around my shoulders. My skin was clear, healthy, unmarked by illness. My eyes were bright and sharp. I looked nothing like the woman who'd died at 29. I looked nothing like the girl who'd been invisible in her own family. I looked like someone who'd won. And in the reflection behind me, I could swear I saw her. My previous self, the woman who died and somehow given me this chance. She was smiling. Thank you, I whispered to her. To me. To whoever had made this second chance possible. And then I turned away from the mirror, left my apartment, and went to live the life I'd earned. The life Melissa had tried to take from me twice. The life that was finally, completely, triumphantly mine.